At 3:30 in the morning on July 13, 2002, a man walked into a North Phoenix apartment carrying a cup of gasoline mixed with styrofoam. He looked at the couple sitting on the sofa and told them not to talk behind people's backs. Then he doused them and struck a match. 21-year-old Charles Perez and his girlfriend Nova Banta ran screaming from the apartment, both completely engulfed in flames. Perez died in agony the following day. Nova survived, with third-degree burns covering 75% of her body. This was revenge for a stolen shotgun that may not have even been stolen. And it ended with a needle in Florence, Arizona, 24 years later. If you are new to this channel, like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a video. To understand how it came to this, you need to go back to the morning of July 13, 2002 in North Phoenix. Because the real story starts long before May 20th, 2026. Inside a cramped one-bedroom apartment where too many broken people were crammed together, all of them running on drugs. On May 20th, 2026, the state of Arizona executed Leroy Dean McGill for the murder of Charles Perez. But before we get to that needle, you need to know who Charles Perez actually was. And you need to understand exactly what was happening inside that apartment in the weeks before McGill walked back through its door with a cup of fire. Charles Perez was 21 years old when Leroy McGill set him on fire on July 13, 2002. He was living in a North Phoenix apartment with his girlfriend, Nova Banta. They were part of a loose, drifting community of people surviving on the margins, crashing where they could, using drugs when they had them, holding on to whatever stability the day offered. Charles was not a man without flaws. In fact, he was a drug dealer in the apartment. Nobody in that apartment was. But he was somebody's son. And the thing that cost him his life was not a crime. It was not a threat. It was a word, spoken to the apartment owner about a missing gun, that Leroy McGill decided was worth killing over. After the attack on July 13th, Charles Perez was taken to a hospital in Phoenix. Prosecutors said he experienced extreme pain in those final hours. Burns covered 80% of his body when he died on July 14, 2002, one day after the attack. He was 21 years old. Nova Banta survived. But surviving is not the same as walking away. She spent years recovering from third-degree burns across 3/4 of her body. She then walked into a courtroom and identified the man who did it to her. And she waited 24 years to watch it end. And the perpetrator was Leroy Dean McGill. Leroy Dean McGill has just been executed for the crime he committed on July 13, 2002, when he was 39 years old. The deliberate burning alive of Charles Perez and the attempted burning alive of Nova Banta at a North Phoenix apartment in the early hours of that morning. Leroy Dean McGill was born on February 22, 1963, in Arizona. His father, an undercover vice cop, had an affair with a woman he had arrested. His parents divorced while his mother was pregnant with him. After the divorce, his mother packed their belongings into a trailer and moved the family to Phoenix when McGill was just 4 months old. By age 8, McGill and some of his siblings were put in foster care as his mother struggled to care for 5 children. Much of his childhood was spent moving between homes and institutions, including foster care homes, boys' ranches, and reform schools like Buckner's Boys Ranch in Texas and Boysville in San Antonio. He had prior convictions, including armed robberies, and struggled with methamphetamine addiction. By every account from people who knew him in the years before the crime, McGill was a man bouncing between unstable housing, short-term jobs, and drug use. The problem is, when accused of stealing a shotgun, the man who had already lived a life of crime chose revenge in one of the most sadistic ways possible. By the summer of 2002, McGill was 39 years old, unemployed, homeless, and deep into addiction to methamphetamine and marijuana. He had a girlfriend named Jonna Hardesty, who went by the nickname Angel. In mid-2002, McGill lost his job. With no income and no home, he and Jonna Hardesty drifted through Phoenix's drug community, sleeping wherever they could. They ended up at a small one-bedroom apartment in North Phoenix owned by a man named Jack Yates. The apartment was tiny. One bedroom for Yates. Everyone else shared the single common room, which served as kitchen, living room, and sleeping space all at once. At various points, that room held Eddie and Kim Keefe and their 2 young daughters, Jonna Hardesty's brother Jeff Yule, Charles Perez, and Nova Banta. 7, sometimes 8 adults, plus 2 children, in a space built for one person. All of them, to varying degrees, using drugs. All of them living on top of each other, day after day, with no privacy, no peace, and no real way forward. The first fault line was between Jonna Hardesty and Nova Banta. The 2 women had never gotten along. Their friction was constant, and it poisoned the atmosphere for everyone else. Then something happened that pushed everything past the breaking point. Yates' shotgun went missing. And when it happened, Banta told Yates that her boyfriend Charles Perez had seen McGill and Hardesty take it. That accusation, whether true or not, was all it took. Yates told McGill and Hardesty they were no longer welcome, and they had to leave. They moved into a house owned by a woman named Sophia Barnhart, a short walk from the Yates apartment. Justin Johnson also stayed there, along with Barnhart's oldest son Dean. It was close enough to the Yates apartment that McGill could practically see the building from where he slept. And that proximity kept his anger alive. He talked about revenge. He brooded on it. And he fed it with more methamphetamine, day after day, night after night, until he had not slept in several days and his mind was operating in a state that no longer resembled rational thought. On the evening of July 12, 2002, McGill, Hardesty, Barnhart, and Justin Johnson sat together at Barnhart's house and smoked marijuana. Marijuana they had purchased from Charles Perez. The same man McGill was already planning to destroy. At approximately 3:30 a.m. on July 13, 2002, while everyone at Barnhart's house slept, McGill got up. He had already prepared the gasoline mixed with pieces of a styrofoam cup into it, deliberately and methodically, to create a substance that investigators would later describe as napalm-like. Something that would adhere to skin. Something that would not simply burn but stick and burn. McGill allegedly bragged about this to witnesses afterward. He had wanted maximum pain. He walked the short distance back to the Yates apartment. Outside, he ran into Eddie Keith and Jeff Yule. He looked at Keith and told him to take his wife and daughters and get out of the apartment. He was going to teach Perez a lesson. Keith pleaded with him. McGill, in a strange moment of selective restraint, agreed to spare Jack Yates. But Charles Perez and Nova Banta were not going to be spared. Jeff let him in. Perez and Banta were sitting next to each other on the sofa in the common room. It was 3:30 in the morning. They were not expecting trouble. They were just there. McGill looked at them. He said calmly, as if delivering a perfectly reasonable observation in the middle of the night. He said people should not talk behind other people's backs. Before either of them could speak, he threw the gasoline mixture over both of them and struck a match. Nova Banta later testified exactly what she saw in that moment. She said, "He looked at me and Perez and said Perez shouldn't talk behind other people's backs. And he poured the gasoline on us and quickly lit a match and threw it at us." Both of them ran screaming from the apartment, completely on fire. Another resident grabbed a blanket and used it to beat the flames off Nova Banta. It saved her life. The fire gutted the Yates apartment entirely and spread to the unit next door, forcing other residents to flee. Charles Perez was rushed to a hospital. He died the following morning, July 14, 2002, with burns covering 80% of his body, in extreme pain. McGill did not stay to face what he had done. He fled Arizona and made his way north to Minnesota, where he was later arrested and returned to Arizona to face charges. In the months that followed the attack, investigators built their case around Banta's identification, the physical evidence recovered from the burned apartment, gasoline residue, styrofoam fragments consistent with the mixture McGill had described to witnesses, and the testimony of Eddie Keith and Jeff Ewell, both of whom confirmed that McGill had warned Keith to remove his family before entering the apartment. McGill was formally indicted on March 11, 2003, 8 months after the attack, on 4 counts: first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, arson, and endangerment. He never admitted to the crime in court. He never admitted it to his family. But the evidence left nowhere to hide. The trial took place in Maricopa County, Arizona in October 2004 before the Arizona Superior Court. The defense led with mitigation. Attorneys argued that McGill's childhood abuse, mental impairment, emotional immaturity, and severe methamphetamine addiction meant he deserved life rather than death. They asked the jury to look at the broken man behind the act and find room for mercy. The jury deliberated for less than 1 hour. On October 27, 2004, Leroy Dean McGill was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of Charles Perez, attempted first-degree murder in the attack on Nova Banta, arson, and endangerment. He was sentenced to death. Following his October 2004 sentencing, Leroy Dean McGill was sent to the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence, Arizona, a sprawling, aging facility in the desert heat of Pinal County that has served as the site of most of Arizona's executions for decades. He would spend the next 22 years there. Over those years, McGill filed appeals at both state and federal levels, working through every available legal avenue to stop his execution. Different courts reviewed his case at different levels. Every single one reached the same conclusion: his crimes were heinous and depraved. His sentence would stand. By 2022, McGill had exhausted every appeal. There was nothing left to file. In early 2026, the Arizona Attorney General's office asked the Arizona Supreme Court to issue an execution warrant. On March 26, 2026, the Arizona Supreme Court agreed and set the date, May 20, 2026 at 10 a.m. On the morning of May 20, 2026, Leroy Dean McGill woke up at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence for the last time. For his last meal, McGill requested onion rings, bread and butter, a green salad, and chocolate cake. At 10 a.m. on May 20, 2026, it was time. His attorney was present as a witness. Leroy Dean McGill's friend Grover was also there. At exactly 10 a.m., Leroy Dean McGill climbed onto the gurney in the death chamber at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Florence, by himself. Then the curtains opened. His final statement included, "I just want to thank everyone for being so accommodating and nice." He also said, "I'm going home soon." No remorse in his words or apology to his victims. Victim representatives did not attend the execution. Unfortunately, Charles Perez had no one in that witness room to see justice done on his behalf. At approximately 10 a.m., the lethal injection was administered. At 10:26 a.m., Leroy Dean McGill was pronounced dead. He was 63 years old. He was Arizona's first execution of 2026 and the 13th in the United States that year. Arizona currently holds 108 inmates on death row. Leroy Dean McGill is now gone. Charles Perez never got to live out his 20s, and Nova Banta must live with the trauma and scars of that morning forever. McGill spent 22 years on death row without ever admitting what he did. He never confessed to his family. He never acknowledged it in court. And in his final moments, strapped to a gurney in Florence, Arizona, he thanked the staff for their hospitality and said he was going home. But the question that remains is this: when a crime is deliberately cruel and painful, does society have a duty to answer with the ultimate punishment? Or does executing a man after more than 2 decades on death row, who had a broken childhood and addiction struggles, cross into something else? Was justice truly served here? Or did something go wrong along the way? Drop your answer in the comments below. And if this case stayed with you, like, comment, share, and subscribe for more true crime stories like this. If you're a lover of creepy true crime stories, true crime documentaries, horror crime, unsolved mysteries, and the rest, you can do well to check out our twin channel Mysterious Dark Files for more videos like that.